All right, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of the Ghostbusters rant. There's a whole bunch of crows going on outside and a non-0% chance of sirens. So maybe there's something strange going on in my neighborhood. I don't know. If I see something weird and it don't look good, I'll give the Ghostbusters a call. But until then, we are going to answer what would it mean for the Ghostbusters to actually actively be gods? What would that look like? And to answer that question, we're going to have to tie up some loose ends from the last discussion, rant, what have you. And those are how magic works, the kitchen sink question, and then the ghost classifications. So, without much further ado, there's also, and I'll hold this till the end, going over the vampire test that I mentioned. And also, I'm going to fit in here at the beginning clarification on the interactions between Vince and Gozer, and possibly another explanation for Gozer's senses and kind of what leads to that scene where she asks if they're gods. So, let's get into it. So, in the last video, I kind of guessed that Gozer had godly senses and was able to identify the many pocket dimensions each of the Ghostbusters were carrying on their belts, and then surmised that they were gods. But rewatching Ghostbusters 1, it stood out to me that it seems more like Vince is a scout, and that he's going around and looking for non-human entities. That's why he's disappointed, and actually that explains why the first non-human that he sees is that horse, and he's so drawn to it, and that's why he thinks it's, that's why he treats it like an ally. And when he gets back to Gozer, there's a really short little snippet where it looks like they might be having a conversation, and this could very well be Vince reporting back to Gozer, hey, there's no ghosts, and these guys might be responsible. It's funny that Vince ends up in the Ghostbusters headquarters and kind of acts a little stupid, like we're not sure how much information he's really gathering there. But he doesn't seem to be aware that just below him is the main containment unit with all the ghosts that he's probably looking for. So it's apparent that he's not aware of that, because if he was, he would probably go down there, even in Lewis's body, and try to let out, all the ghosts. So Gozer may not have godly senses in that way. She may still have, the ability to sense magic and what have you. But the information she may be going on may simply be what Vince tells her, which again is that, hey, there's not a lot of ghost activity like we were expecting. And, also maybe he mentioned something about the Ghostbusters, or at the very least, Gozer could say there's a whole lot less ghosts and there's something weird going on. These are opposing these, Ghostbusters are opposing me. Let me just put two and two together and assume, the problems are related. And then also, if Ray had answered, yes, we are gods, it's very likely that due to Gozer's character, she may very well have just said, okay, well, now I'm going to declare war on your domain. And she would have just summoned the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man anyway. So there you have that. Now the kitchen sink, or I guess, should we do the magic? Yeah, I guess so. To get to the magic first, it's pretty clear based on what we get in Ghostbusters 2 that we are indeed working on 40k Warhammer 40k rules, where the Immaterium is a manifestation of negative emotions, and that all magic comes from manipulation of ectoplasm. And that also explains the Ghostbusters technology. They've figured out a way to manipulate ectoplasm. They just don't do it by whatever psychic means, if we're, going by 40K rules, that someone like maybe Vigo does. So also, I'd like to point you to a number of very awesome videos. There's a whole series by the channel Channeling Spirits on how the Ghostbusters equipment works. And wow, it's really cool. They actually go into all the fictional physics, and I didn't realize how much work had been done either before and or after to really like sort these things out. And there's a whole lot of cool stuff that explains ghosts and ectoplasm and how the proton packs work and what psychokinetic energy is. And they also explain additional things like Egon's Geiger meter from Ghostbusters 2. So go check those out. I definitely underestimated how much like fictional science went into this, but it was really cool because it cements Ghostbusters as a sci-fi setting. And getting now to the kitchen sink question, it really then makes a lot more sense if it's a sci-fi setting, that because we are operating on 40K Immaterium warp rules, to answer the kitchen sink question, no, there are not other monsters. Just like in 40K, the Eldar aren't really elves. They're just bioengineered creatures, I think, by the old ones, made by the old ones, just like the orcs. So, although, I mean, like, not that you couldn't have like fantasy in sci-fi, but when you say that things operate by certain rules, then really what you get is motifs. You get things in name, like the Eldar, as opposed to maybe Warhammer Fantasy. Although I'm not quite sure exactly how magic works in Warhammer Fantasy and how the elves came to be. I'm not at all learned on Warhammer Fantasy lore, or I guess nowadays what they call Age of Sigmar. But in Ghostbusters, there are no vampires, there are no werewolves, there are no witches, not in the way that we think of them. There may be, but what Ghostbusters would then explain is that the way they were doing that is by manipulating ectoplasm. So we then have to assume in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire that the Fire Masters, which I think originally I called Fire Lords, confused them with Avatar: The Last Airbender for some reason. The Fire Masters, the way they create the brass sphere to trap Garaka is probably some kind of ectoplasm interaction. Like if the Ghostbusters analyzed how the brass sphere worked, they would find that maybe it had certain properties that like resonated with certain like subatomic frequencies, or like affected ion radiation or something. Like maybe there's like a lead component to the sphere somewhere or whatever. Like there would be some way that they could analyze it that would explain, because everything is science-ified or whatever, science-y in Ghostbusters. It's a sci-fi setting, so there would be a scientific explanation for what was happening. And we know this because we know all of their experiments in Ghostbusters 2 showed the effects of ectoplasm, the magic that Vigo was doing, was being created by the energy stored in ectoplasm from negative emotions. And another interesting thing that the Channeling Spirits videos pointed out was that ectoplasm manifests in various forms. Ghosts are ectoplasm. Like there's even a line, Ray calls them ectoplasmic entities. So ghosts are made of ectoplasm just as much as the slime is ectoplasm. So it can have like different phase states, maybe you could think of it like that. But they're all affected by the same emotional mechanics. So now is a good time then to get into the ghost classifications, because I think the way that we get them, there's 7 ghost classifications, and although they do come from, or at least the chart comes from the Ghostbusters role-playing game, I'm pretty sure all the classifications are canon. But the problem is that there's no useful taxonomy for understanding ghosts or the immaterium based on those classifications. They are kind of meaningless. So to briefly go through them, number 1 is just disembodied effects like phantom lights or phantom voices, things like that. The second one, class 2, is disembodied manifestations like ghostly hands or floating sheets or like a floating head or something. They don't necessarily have as much intentionality as other entities. Maybe they're just kind of mindless, like on a routine, but they can be dangerous. Classes, I keep saying number, class 3 and class 4 are both human ghosts, but 3 is unidentified, class 4 is identified. One, two, three, four. So class 5 is the Slimer class. This is non-human ghosts. Class 6 is animal ghosts. And class 7 is powerful and malignant ghosts. So these don't really tell you anything interesting about any of the classes. There's no explanatory distinctions. So it would be much more useful to know the origin of the ghost. Like number 5 is kind of interesting because it seems like that's warp entities. But the problem with it is that class 5 doesn't actually distinguish where Slimer comes from. Did Slimer manifest in the immaterium and then somehow make his way here? Or did he manifest on the material plane? Because as stated by the class, Ray says he's a non-human entity. So is he alien? Is he from the immaterium? Was Ray wrong with it? Like, is he a human ghost that's been horribly deformed or something? I don't know. So not only would it be more useful to know where the ghost came from, but also how powerful it was, maybe in terms of like the intensity of the proton beam that would be needed, like the minimum intensity to contain it. That would be a useful variable. Another useful variable might be how much space they take up in the containment unit. But we don't really get any of those things with the classifications as given, so that's kind of a problem. But it would be interesting in the Ghostbusters movies if it could show kind of more of their research, like understanding, but actually showing it in the movie, showing them doing the research and like explaining more to the audience about how ghost things work. So I don't know, but I guess so. Now is where we get into the really interesting stuff. So this is like all this leading up. We've kind of laid some breadcrumbs to some interesting questions. Let's answer some of those. So what would it look like if the Ghostbusters were gods? Well, I think what we get here is that they've privatized the afterlife. And for a number of reasons, the first one being that Ghostbusters, because it's operating on 40K rules, proves that there is no other afterlife. There is nothing else. It seems like when ghosts finish their unfinished business, which also seems kind of dubious, they just evaporate. Like they kind of allude to there being something else, but it's not really we're not really sure what that is. It's not really confirmed. But they could just evaporate. But the quote unquote unfinished business could also just be conditional. Like if a ghost is created through traumatic events, because that's what creates the ectoplasm they manifest from, then they have unfinished business. But as we saw in Frozen Empire, when Phoebe becomes a ghost, she doesn't instantly just evaporate because she has no unfinished business. She remains a ghost. So it's very possible that the mechanism by which the ghosting happens determines how immortal they are, or whether their immortality is conditional. So that's interesting. The other thing, of course, is that, like I mentioned in the first rant, that you don't have to have containment units just for like evil ghosts. You could have them for either experimenting with ectoplasm to make items that can exist on the immaterial plane out of ectoplasm, but also why not have containment units that aren't locked for good ghosts, for friendly ghosts, like people who are terminally ill, who don't want to die, who are definitely terminally ill and suffering. Like, you have a painless way to give them immortality and they can just be a ghost. And then, as they've explained in, I think it's Frozen Empire, that as a ghost, you can learn how to interact with the material plane. And we've seen throughout all of the movies that almost all of the ghosts learn how to do this, like, on a spectrum that ranges from not being able to all the way up to fully manifested Vigo, not even being transparent as a ghost, being able to walk on the marble of the museum and pick up the baby. Like, physically pick up the baby, walk around, like his footsteps echo. His boots are hitting the floor. So he's fully manifested at that point. And so apparently, and I'm sure based on research they do and things they could add to like added technology to help ghosts do this, I'm sure they could just make people immortal and give them ghost powers. Like, at the full end of this, once the technology gets good enough, you basically have a way to just turn people into gods, because now you're just allowing them to exist on both planes, to not age, and to be deathless. Plus, they now have magic. So, like, at the full extent of this idea, that's, I think, where that goes. But at the start, I mean, really, since there are no other afterlives, it's weird to think, but the Ghostbusters have demonstrated that when people die in the Ghostbusters universe, they just evaporate, unless they have unfinished business, in which case they're going to evaporate eventually. But if the Ghostbusters were to ghost people and then give them a place to live, like Phoebe, they would just continue existing, and they could learn to interact with the world. Like, they could, I mean, there would have to, Ghostbusters always loves to get into the like nitty gritty of the world. And so I'm sure there'd be like legislation and things that were governing this new afterlife that people could purchase or whatever. But the Ghostbusters are definitely in it to make a buck. And what better service is there than not dying? I don't know. It's kind of a cool idea. So since the Ghostbusters have made containment units, and we saw in Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, they stated the engineers can make more. So they can make containment units at their need, and the ones for good ghosts don't have to be locked. The only reason the evil ones are locked is because you don't want them getting out. But that's not the case for other ghosts. So maybe let's see some ghost apartment units. I don't know. But that's it for the Ghostbusters topics. Now let's get to the vampire test. I don't know if other writers and creators do this consciously, but I've noticed it over the years, and I think I finally understand that vampires seem to be the best litmus test for, if you're a creator, figuring out if your setting is fully fleshed out, and then if you're a reader, you can ask the vampire question to understand how the setting works. And I don't know if there's any other monster that really does it this way. And of course, this is just for genre fiction, but it's for a number of reasons that define like what a vampire is. So vampires are immortal. They have to answer the soul question. They have additional powers, whether it's just physical or more. You have to explain how those powers work. And of course, they're also all human. They have to be able to like blend in. And once you get all those, you have to answer the cosmological question of the setting, or lack thereof. You have to answer how magic works or not. and then you kind of have to answer like a power scaling question. And so to take some examples, you can ask in Ghostbusters, like we just did, do vampires exist? So let's back up here. So when you ask the vampire question, it answers, is your setting fully fleshed out and how does it work? The questions you ask are, do vampires exist? And if so, how do they work? And if they don't, why not? Those four questions, or, probably two, answer, is your setting fully fleshed out and how does it work? So if we ask in Ghostbusters, are there vampires? And if so, how do they work? The answer is no. Why not? Well, because just like in 40K, all magic is ectoplasm based. So there's no arcane magic. There's no outside magic. There is no soul that a vampire would lose. Like, we do have souls, but they don't matter that way. So a vampire isn't really like wouldn't lose anything. There's no cost to being a vampire. And every monster in Ghostbusters, just like in 40K, is warp based. So like in 40K, what kind of vampires do you have? You go back to Rogue Trader, you have the giant alien bat, which may even be able to shapeshift, but it's basically like a warp tainted alien animal. It's a giant mutant bat. And then you also get something like the Blood Angels. And so wherever they can, they will use warp magic to give a vampire motif, but you don't have any literal vampires because the mechanics of the setting don't work that way. And the same is true for Star Wars, because you don't have magic, you have the Force. Normal people don't worry about not becoming Force ghosts. So a normal person wouldn't worry about becoming a vampire. And also then you run into the problem of like needing to drink blood. Well, you could very easily run into a situation where there's just a bunch of aliens around you. There's no blood to drink. Maybe they don't even have blood in their biology. Who knows? Like, but whatever they do have wouldn't sate you. Like, if you were a vampire in Star Wars, you would die. So, yeah. But then, so when you ask, what is a vampire in Dungeons and Dragons, this is really fascinating. So, of all the monsters that exist in Dungeons and Dragons, when you ask what a vampire is, it answers every question about how Dungeons and Dragons works. Because there are souls, you have to understand how the cosmology of Dungeons and Dragons works to understand what becoming a vampire means. And then you also have to understand how the magic system works. And then you also understand, you could think of this in terms of like hit dice or challenge rating, if you like, however, either, both. The power scaling question. And this is true for, as far as I can tell, every single genre setting. So if you're a world builder, you can use this. And if you're a reader and you find learning about settings inaccessible, the first thing you should try to figure out is, do vampires exist in this setting? And if so, how? And if they don't, try and figure out what prevents vampires from existing in the setting. And researching that will explain to you how everything works. It's really weird. I don't know why. I don't know how exactly, aside from what I've explained. But there you go. There's the vampire test. So that's the end of this video. Hope I entertained you. Hope you learned something. Hope you found it interesting. Go check out Channeling Spirits. They have a bunch of cool videos. Ghostbusters, let's see you privatize the afterlife. That should be the next movie. Or, that's why I said, like, that's why you can make it like a cyberpunk. That's why I think something like that would work better in like a cyberpunk setting. Like a near future where Ghostbusters has become more of an institution. I think that'd be kind of more interesting. I don't know, but like, I guess then you kind of skip over the history of that. So it would also be interesting to like see that play out in movie time, not skip ahead and then have flashbacks or exposition explaining it. But I don't know. Either way, whatever works best. So that's it. Thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video.